Oliver Lynch had never been the kind of man who chased conflict, but he had always been the kind of man who kept his land in perfect order. His house sat on a wide, sloped lot that faced the northern edge of a long, glinting artificial lake, carved decades ago by a now-defunct land development company and sustained over the years by a complex but largely forgotten system of flood control, channels, overflow reliefs, and subterranean drainage valves. He had bought the property 15 years ago during a legal loophole auction that offered private lake access and full ownership of the adjacent water infrastructure. Most people avoided lots like his. Too much maintenance, too isolated. But Oliver had seen it differently. The moment he walked the shore and saw the ragged remains of the old timber bridge stretching from his yard to a forested peninsula across the lake, he knew what this place could become. Not just a home, but a barrier. Not just property, but perimeter. Not just quiet. Sovereignty. He wasn't rich, but he was precise. A former maritime inspection officer with a background in inland waterway compliance, Oliver had no patience for sloppiness, negligence, or suburban theater. He didn't care about lawn care regulations, paint color codes, or community mailboxes. What he cared about was knowing every inch of his land, the tensile resistance of his own wooden beams, the slope grade of his shore embankment, the depth fluctuations in the lake after seasonal rainfall. Over the years, Oliver had personally rebuilt the old bridge not for nostalgia or aesthetic pleasure, but for function. The structure was modest but robust. A pressure-treated support frame tied to reinforced concrete piling submerged in carefully monitored soil. It served as a working access point to the peninsula, a natural wind buffer for the shoreline, and, though few realized it, an anchoring point for a water retention function embedded in the landscape design. The bridge wasn't just wood and bolts. It was a regulator of the lake's shape, its currents, its depth integrity. The peninsula itself was uninhabited, thick with oak and scrub pine, technically part of Oliver's parcel and registered as undeveloped conservation buffer zone. That didn't stop the people across the lake, residents of a sprawling upscale housing development, from pretending it was part of their view. Their lots were clean, geometric, and staggered for lake visibility. Every house had the same polished dock, the same slick kayak rack, the same artificially rippling patio flag. They sipped chilled wine and stared at the glinting water like it was part of their entitled reflection. But the irony was this. The very lake that boosted their home values, that defined their Instagram-ready property brochures, that sold the illusion of resort living to buyers from upstate, that lake remained stable only because of the reinforced embankment on Oliver's side and the pressure system beneath his modest bridge. He didn't talk about that. He didn't need to. Let them have their cookouts, their quarterly meetings, their newsletter about goose droppings. He wasn't a member. He didn't vote in their pool regulations or argue about HOA landscaping priorities. He just maintained the flood diversion valve under the south pile of the bridge, ran pressure checks after storms, and watched, with a grim kind of satisfaction, as the lake behaved itself year after year. And in return, he was left alone. Mostly. There had been a few brushes over the years, some overly ambitious real estate agents trying to reclassify shoreline easements, a golf cart that once wandered onto his gravel drive and left in reverse before Oliver even made it to the porch. One holiday season, someone taped a flyer to his mailbox offering to buy the peninsula for community beautification purposes, complete with a crude mock-up of a walking trail and dog park. Oliver shredded it in silence. He didn't escalate. He didn't push. He didn't need to. He knew the law better than they did, but things had been changing lately. Not loudly, but slowly. First came the orange flags, little plastic markers driven into the gravel near the edge of his lot line. Then, a month later, he noticed a drone hovering across the lake for nearly 20 minutes, drifting closer than any recreational flyer had a right to be. After that, a temporary floating barrier appeared at the far side of the peninsula, marked with a buoy that read, "Private Project Survey in Progress." Oliver made some calls. No permits had been filed, no survey declared. The barrier disappeared 2 days later. He didn't get an answer and he didn't press. He just made notes, logged the dates, measured the waterline drop after heavy rainfall. He noticed the lake had begun to hold just a little more water than usual. Not much, just enough that it annoyed him. Then came the night. It was late March, nearly midnight. The moon was low and the wind was sharp. Oliver had been asleep, but some unplaceable sound stirred him. A vibration in the floorboards, a low mechanical hum that didn't belong to any wildlife or wind. When he stepped out onto the back porch, the air smelled faintly of diesel. He saw nothing. No lights, no movement, but he felt it. The stillness. Something had shifted. He walked down the wooden steps toward the bridge, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the water. And there, where the arch of his bridge should have risen like a backbone from the shore, nothing, just black water and scattered debris. He didn't shout, he didn't run. He walked, slow, methodical. The wooden planks of the shore were splintered. The mooring bolts had been sheared clean, not by weather or decay, but by force, mechanical, deliberate, hydraulic. He found tire tracks behind the tool shed. Fresh, wide tread, low pressure, industrial equipment. And then, rising in his throat, something he hadn't felt in years, cold, quiet fury. In the morning, there was no apology, no notice, only a single sheet of paper tucked beneath a rock near the base of his back steps, stamped with the logo of a neighborhood development authority and the vague heading, "Unauthorized Structure Removal, Safety Compliance Protocol." No name. No contact, no explanation. Just a list of guidelines and a final line that stated, in neatly typed serif font, any restoration activity must be pre-approved by designated watershed stewardship representatives. That was how it began. Not with warning, not with argument, not even with confrontation, just subtraction, just silence. Just a bridge gone in the night. And with it, the first thread unraveling the structure beneath a system far more fragile than anyone on the other side of the lake had ever imagined. Oliver spent the next 2 hours sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring at the vacant space where the bridge used to span. In the growing morning light, he could see the way the lake had changed overnight. Not just the missing structure, but the subtle realignment of water near the shore. The sediment drift was different. The shallow shelf near the embankment had deepened by at least 3 inches, a sign that the balance had been disrupted. He stood up stiffly and walked the perimeter of his land, boots crunching through damp gravel and brittle grass. The tire tracks were still there, faint now in the glare of the morning sun, but unmistakable. Whoever had come, and it was clearly more than one vehicle, had entered from the maintenance road that curved along the far woods, a rarely used access route known only to county workers and, perhaps, developers with too much reach. When Oliver finally walked back toward the house, he noticed something he'd missed in the haze of shock. A temporary chain-link fence had been installed roughly 50 yards down the shoreline, right at the edge of his property line. Or, at least what? The association claimed it to be. The fencing was clean, fresh, bolted into the earth, and it ran from the water up to the base of the old stone wall that separated his land from the beginning of the public trail system. A laminated notice flapped in the wind, zip-tied to the middle panel. It read, "Work Zone, Aquatic Safety Enhancement, Do Not Remove." At the bottom was the name of a private contracting company, Shoreline Dynamics, LLC, along with a phone number that directed callers to a voicemail. Oliver didn't leave a message. He knew better. He drove into town instead. At the county records office, he requested the most recent filings for aquatic development permits and infrastructure modifications. The clerk, a young man who barely looked 25, took his sweet time before returning with a short stack of thin folders. Oliver thumbed through them with steady hands, recognizing none of the official language from previous years. There had been a reclassification, it seemed, and not a small one. The lake, previously categorized as a stabilized artificial basin under single-owner boundary governance, had, just 2 months earlier, been refiled under multi-access hydrological influence, which meant, in plain terms, that any party with declared interest in its shorelines could petition for limited-use improvements under the banner of watershed management. Oliver stared at the form that approved the reclassification. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone from the Regional Development Liaison Office, a name he didn't recognize, and beneath that the project description: Lakefront Retention Adjustment, Phase 1. The goal: removal of obstructions to natural aquatic flow. Oliver leaned back in his chair, the metal creaking beneath him, and let the phrase settle in his gut like bad steel. His bridge wasn't just gone. It had been declared a blockage, a hazard, a thing in the way of progress. Back home, he pulled the original deed from his fireproof cabinet, the one from the auction, back when the property was listed in a poorly advertised government sale. It stated, in plain, unambiguous terms, that the bridge and the land beneath it fell within his property line. It included topographic overlays and a hydrological appendix confirming the engineered support features. That, he now realized, was the real threat. It wasn't the bridge itself they had removed. It was what the bridge did. It stabilized water flow. It kept the peninsula rooted. It prevented the far shore, the luxury development side, from experiencing gradual but measurable erosion during the spring flood cycle. That meant if the bridge stayed, their shoreline costs rose. If the bridge stayed, their docks started to sag. If the bridge stayed, the illusion of pristine balance became just that: illusion. 3 days later, a white pickup truck rolled onto his property without warning. 2 men in identical gray polos stepped out. One carried a tablet, the other a clipboard. They didn't ask permission, they didn't knock. They simply walked the edge of the now barren bank, scanning the shoreline with what looked like a LiDAR unit and making occasional notes. Oliver watched them from the porch for nearly 5 minutes before approaching, his voice flat and low as he asked them who had authorized the intrusion. The taller one, tablet guy, offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said they were from the Neighborhood Shoreline Committee, here to assess post-removal stabilization potential. The shorter one handed Oliver a glossy brochure that looked like it had been printed yesterday. On the cover was a mock-up of what the lakefront would look like once enhancement goals were complete. New trails, a kayak drop-in, a seasonal gazebo. Oliver didn't take the brochure. He told them to leave. They said they had permission. He said they were on private land. They claimed revised easement language. He said he had legal maps. The argument ended not with shouting, but with silence, and a quiet understanding on both sides. This wasn't an inspection. It was a declaration. The next morning, a package arrived at his gate. No return address, but professionally bound. Inside was a 30-page packet titled Watershed Realignment Recommendations. Citizen feedback requested. Page 12 detailed cooperative property updates, and mentioned that certain parcels, his included, had been identified as key contributors to holistic hydrodynamic regulation. In plain English, they wanted the rest of the system. Not just the bridge, not just the shoreline. The valve beneath his lot, the one that controlled the overflow release that had, for years, prevented spring flooding. And suddenly, it became clear. They weren't interested in just removing obstructions. They were interested in control. With the bridge gone, the next move would be the valve. With the valve under their jurisdiction, they could raise or lower the lake at will, adjust marketability, plan events, build more, and any resistance would be framed not as legal protection but as obstinacy, as sabotage, as non-cooperation. That same afternoon, a neighbor from 3 lots down, a man Oliver had spoken to maybe twice in 15 years, showed up unannounced with a pie and a polite smile. He was just checking in, wanted to see how Oliver was doing, and happened to mention that the new plans would really open up the lakefront. Some folks are just nervous about changes, but hey, it's for the good of the whole community, right? Oliver didn't answer. He just looked at the man's shoes, spotless, soft-soled, never worn on wet earth, and said, "There is no hole. There's my land, and there's what's coming for it." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. By then, he had already begun to draft the formal notice. Not of legal resistance, not of protest, but of adjustment, because the valve still worked, because it was still his, and because if they wanted to force change, they would have to face what change really meant. Control went both ways, and they just reminded him how dangerous it was to forget that. Oliver didn't move quickly, but he moved deliberately. Within 48 hours of the last unwelcome visit, he had filed a formal injunction request with the county registrar, citing unlawful access and unauthorized structural removal. It wasn't about winning. It was about record-keeping, making sure that every footstep on his land now existed in a paper trail with his name at the top and liability hanging like a weight beneath it. He contacted a local land use attorney, not someone from a billboard or online ad, but an old-school name he found through a water commission contact. A woman named Darlene West, whose reputation for methodical litigation had earned her the nickname the Silt Widow among developers. Slow, inevitable, and able to choke a project without ever raising her voice. She reviewed the original purchase agreement and confirmed what Oliver already knew. The land, the valve system, and the bridge, though now missing, were all explicitly private infrastructure, and any modifications without consent were not just violations, they were legal exposure. The problem wasn't law. The problem was maneuvering. The next blow came not from the system, but from silence. Calls to the shoreline contractor went unanswered. Requests for development plans were redirected in loops, voicemails led nowhere, and even basic inquiries to the planning committee returned automated statements that active projects are currently under revision and subject to non-disclosure under Community Improvement Guidelines. It was bureaucratic fog, thick, gray, and meant to disorient. Oliver responded by cutting through it. He scheduled a private surveyor, an older man named Shank who didn't smile and didn't talk, but who walked the shoreline with a laser transit scope and a weatherproof clipboard and left with 5 pages of notes. 2 days later, Shank sent a document that made Oliver's jaw tighten. The lake's waterline had risen 3 inches in 8 weeks, a shift more than double the seasonal average, and sediment displacement on Oliver's shore indicated unnatural release control from the opposite bank. That meant one thing: someone had already begun manipulating the lake levels. With the bridge gone and the shoreline open, the development group had likely engaged in unauthorized testing, using Oliver's side as a relief zone. In other words, his land had become the pressure valve for their experiments, and the destruction of the bridge had simply been a prelude to a more aggressive intrusion. It was a strategic dismantling. Remove the buffer, watch the shoreline bend, then blame natural conditions when instability occurred. Oliver forwarded the survey report to Darlene. Her response was short: "We escalate now." What followed was quiet, legal aggression. Cease and desist letters were issued to Shoreline Dynamics and the neighboring committee. A formal request was filed with the County Hydrology Office demanding an immediate freeze on any watershed alterations within a 2-mile radius pending forensic audit. Simultaneously, Oliver initiated a controlled inspection of the valve itself, hiring 2 licensed engineers to conduct a structural assessment. The report they produced was precise. The valve was under strain. Not failure, not collapse, yet, but pressure curves showed deliberate manipulation in the system. The implication was dangerous. If this continued, the lake could surge or drop rapidly, affecting not just property value but structural integrity of multiple lots. That's when things turned personal. One morning, Oliver awoke to find his utility meter had been flagged for review, resulting in a temporary shutoff of service. When he called the provider, he was told there had been a crossed request from the neighborhood association. Not a cancellation, just a technical miscommunication. The next day, a zoning inspector showed up claiming to be responding to a complaint of unauthorized structures on lakeside property. The man was polite but unfamiliar with the terrain and kept referencing regulations that didn't apply to his parcel. When asked who had filed the complaint, he said it was submitted anonymously. Oliver thanked him, gave him a copy of the deed and a cup of coffee, and watched him drive off down the gravel lane with an apologetic wave. Then came the warning. Not a threat, not in the direct sense, but something much quieter. At the edge of the property, where the stone marker denoted the start of the private embankment, someone had placed a small, precise stake into the ground. On it hung a single laminated card, weatherproofed and stiff. It read, "Cooperation brings balance. Resistance invites disorder." No signature, no seal, just black serif text and a water drop icon at the corner, the same icon used in the community's redevelopment literature. Oliver didn't react, not outwardly, but that night he checked every floodgate, every sensor, every emergency stop point in the valve system. He verified manual control override, tested the pressure gauges, recalibrated the secondary release flow, and confirmed, for himself and for whatever may come, that he still had control. The system was old, yes, but it was precise. Built to last, built to hold back, and, if necessary, built to release. By the end of the week, things escalated again. A new section of modular dock floated near his side of the lake. This one extended from a property previously undeveloped, now showing signs of construction. Graded land, PVC framing, orange mesh fencing. A floating barrel marker had been installed roughly 20 feet from Oliver's shore, tied loosely to a rope that curved out of sight beneath the water. He pulled it in with a rake. Attached to the rope was a sonar puck, a mapping device, the kind used by developers to track lake bed topography. He stored it in his garage, wrapped in a towel. No one came to claim it. The message was clear. They weren't hiding anymore. That evening, a letter arrived, hand-delivered by courier. It was not legal, it was not formal. It was something else. A letter written in calm, professional language expressing growing concern over Oliver's lack of participation in shared water governance and inviting him to attend an upcoming stakeholder alignment session to explore pathways of mutual benefit. It was signed by the Watershed Strategic Vision Council, a name that hadn't existed 3 months ago. Oliver didn't attend. He had already begun drafting his notice, not to the council, not to the neighbors, but to the county, to the Hydrological Oversight Board, and to the Emergency Response Coordinator. His notice was simple. He declared a system integrity risk. The valve required testing. The overflow release needed calibration. He gave them 48 hours notice of a scheduled controlled release to alleviate abnormal lake pressure due to unauthorized upstream activity. He made it all legal, all procedural, and he ensured that once he initiated that release, it would be logged as safety-driven, with documentation, timing, and engineering rationale attached. They wanted to push. They wanted to intimidate. But Oliver had dealt with systems under strain before. He knew that when tension builds, it doesn't matter who owns the shoreline, only who controls the floodgate. The sky was gunmetal gray when the engineers arrived. 2 of them, both county certified, and both clearly uneasy about the reason they'd been called. They had clipboards, digital meters, and high-vis jackets that looked more theatrical than necessary, as if dressing the part would make the risk feel less real. Oliver led them around the back of the house to the recessed valve platform, the concrete hatch half covered by creeping moss and shadowed by years of oak growth. He hadn't opened it fully in more than a decade, only performed surface diagnostics, checked the pressure, confirmed stability. But now, after the escalating tension and invasive behavior from the development side of the lake, there was no question. The system needed to be tested under controlled conditions, and he wasn't about to do it without witnesses. They spent the better part of an hour assessing the integrity of the mechanism. The younger engineer, thin, red-headed, anxious, took readings at every junction point. The older one, a man named Delmar, who had worked on dam safety in 3 different states, did most of the talking. He didn't mince words when the results came in. The system was still functional, but there were clear signs of recent pressure overloads, meaning someone upstream had tampered with retention gates. There were minor irregularities in sediment flow, valve tension buildup that hadn't been there last season, and, most concerning of all, minor erosion detected along the unmaintained auxiliary spill trench that ran through the lower embankment. In plain terms, the valve could still release, but it wouldn't hold forever under this kind of strain. Delmar didn't tell Oliver what to do. Professionals like him didn't offer suggestions they might be liable for, but the look he gave him before leaving was enough. "You've got justification. Just make sure you file the right paperwork." Oliver filed everything that evening. Emergency calibration test scheduled for 48 hours later. Notice submitted to the watershed board, copied to the emergency mitigation office and to Darlene, who replied with a single line, "Do it exactly by the book. Let them be the ones to blink." He spent the next day checking every gear, cleaning grit from the locking teeth, greasing tension brackets that hadn't moved in a decade. The lake was calm that morning, unnaturally calm. No wind, no bird calls. He stared at the water as if it might flinch. The new docks on the far side sat in perfect, smug symmetry, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself feel the weight of what was coming. Because this wasn't about him anymore. Not really. It was about control. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to stop a structure from collapsing in on itself because someone else wanted to rewrite its function. When the moment came, he moved with purpose. The test began precisely at 9:20 OM, with county engineers present on site and remote telemetry calibrated through his access panel. The emergency valve opened at minimal flow. 2% release, enough to lower the lake by less than 4 inches, enough to ease pressure and record results without compromising bank stability. And yet, even before the second gauge had ticked into motion, Oliver heard the hum of engines from across the lake. Vehicles, 3 of them, unmarked, dark, slow-moving, rolling toward the far peninsula with a posture that wasn't inspection. It was reaction. By the time the test concluded 2 hours later, the water had dropped only slightly, but visibly. Some of the new shoreline markers were now misaligned. One of the floating platforms sat at an angle. That same afternoon, the phone calls began. Not to him, but to the county. Complaints, allegations, uncoordinated emergency tests, and disruption of community water levels. By nightfall, he received a message from Delmar. "They're trying to get your test classified as reckless. I've submitted our logs to the board. You followed protocol. Hold position." But Oliver knew what was happening. The development group hadn't expected him to act. They thought he'd resist passively, file protests, grumble. They hadn't counted on him executing a surgical, documented move that shifted physical balance without touching a single piece of their infrastructure. And now, they had no narrative to frame him as the villain without implicating themselves. Still, they tried. A letter arrived the next morning. This one legal. It came from a firm representing the neighborhood's expansion committee, claiming that Oliver's valve calibration had resulted in environmental distress to neighboring parcels, and that he may be liable for remediation costs associated with shoreline destabilization. The letter was coded in legalese, thick with conditional language, but the threat was there. Back off or face the courts. Oliver sent the entire packet to Darlene, who responded with one of her rare multi-sentence emails. She had anticipated this. She already had a countermotion in progress. She attached 3 prior cases where developments attempted to shift water access definitions retroactively and failed. At the bottom of her message was a final line. They're rattled. Good. Stay silent. Let me speak for you now. But silence didn't mean inaction. The day after the letter, Oliver received another unexpected visitor, this time from the Department of Environmental Resources. A man in a pressed shirt and worn boots arrived unannounced to verify physical compliance with your permitted test parameters. Oliver let him through, showed him the logs, the pressure data, the valve housing, the freshly signed inspection reports. The man checked every bolt like he meant it, nodded once, and left without saying a word beyond, "You're fine." Yet that night, something changed. The wind picked up. Clouds moved over the lake like bruises, and for the first time since the test, Oliver felt the water staring back. The peninsula looked darker. The trees bent in a way they hadn't before, and somewhere beneath the surface of things the equilibrium had shifted. Not enough to see, but enough to feel. Because the bridge wasn't the only thing they'd tried to erase. They'd tried to erase boundary itself, between shared and private, between natural and owned, between function and fiction. And what they'd underestimated, what they'd failed to account for, was that systems, even old ones, remember what they were built for. And so do the people who built them. Oliver didn't sleep the night after the inspection. It wasn't anxiety, not in the way most people experienced it. It was anticipation, the coiled awareness that comes when a system is primed for failure and no one's willing to acknowledge it. He sat at the window, lights off, eyes fixed on the far side of the lake, watching as early spring fog curled low across the waterline, muting the lights from the development like scattered embers smothered under smoke. He wasn't waiting for a call. He wasn't expecting a knock at the door. He was waiting for the next move, because after years of stillness the machine had begun to hum, and whoever had thought they could own that hum, shape it, sell it, now had to learn what it meant to be downstream from something they didn't understand. By morning, news of the test had spread wider than expected, not just among local property owners but into the inboxes of insurance auditors, real estate brokers, and, more importantly, regional hydrological compliance officers. A quiet but critical ripple had passed through the administration. No one said the word lawsuit, but it was hovering in the margins of every memo, every email thread marked confidential. Oliver's test had not only documented structural stress, it had exposed pre-existing instability in the entire development plan, which relied on the illusion of a permanent symmetrical shoreline. And now that shoreline was shifting. Not dramatically, not visibly, not enough to spark panic, but enough for surveyors to quietly begin requesting updated water table data, and for property assessors to insert clauses about hydrological variance into new listings. That was when the retaliation escalated. It started with sound, a subtle tactic. A speaker system installed on a floating pontoon barge appeared near the midpoint of the lake. Officially, it was for community announcements and event coordination. Unofficially, it became a source of directed disruption. At sunrise and dusk, the barge emitted soft, intermittent tones. Not loud enough to be considered noise pollution, but enough to carry through Oliver's open windows like a mosquito buzzing at the edge of hearing. Then came the drone. Not the quiet kind from before, but a commercial-grade quadrotor with full camera rigging, hovering low over his dock, sometimes pausing above the valve housing. Each time Oliver reported it, he received polite replies that the flight was within FAA guidelines and part of a community-wide mapping project. No one acknowledged that it targeted only one property. Still, he didn't respond. He logged. He documented. He fed everything to Darlene, who now had a paralegal dedicated solely to compiling incident reports. They were building a portfolio, not to strike, not yet, but to make clear that this wasn't a feud between neighbors. This was systemic pressure being applied against a single lawful landowner in order to extract control through indirect force. And that kind of pressure, when fully exposed, carried consequences that no redevelopment committee wanted publicly litigated. Then came the breaking point. Late one afternoon, while Oliver was checking the erosion sensors along the auxiliary spillway trench, he heard the sound of tires on gravel. Not at his front gate, but from the maintenance trail that skirted the far edge of the peninsula. He turned, squinting through the trees, and saw 3 men in utility vests offloading materials from an unmarked pickup. PVC piping, rebar, quick-set concrete sacks. They weren't contractors. They weren't inspectors. They were laying foundation for something, and they were doing it on the land beyond the former bridge, technically still part of Oliver's parcel. He crossed the shoreline quickly, boots heavy in soft earth, and called out. No answer. When he reached them, one of the men looked up and said, "We've got a work order, realignment footing. You're not supposed to be here." Oliver didn't reply. He pulled out his phone, took photos, license plates, equipment, faces, and the men, seeing this, stopped. One muttered, "It's just a pilot site. We'll pull out." Within 10 minutes, they were gone. The next day, a letter arrived, this time from the County Development Board, not the neighborhood group. It stated that the peninsula had been reassessed as non-exclusive access pending final zoning update, and that temporary stabilization activity may occur under the Urban Resiliency Initiative. The language was careful, dense. It didn't accuse. It didn't admit. It implied. And the implication was clear. They were now trying to erase the border through bureaucracy, redraw his land into the map by procedural bleed. Oliver called Darlene. Her voice was sharper now, more clipped. They've moved into Phase 2. They're going to try to claim utility easement under environmental optimization. If they can reclassify your spill trench as a critical watershed infrastructure, they'll force a review of your title deed. Oliver asked how likely that was. She replied, "They'll fail, eventually, but it'll bury you in paperwork. The goal's to drain you before you win." He asked what they could do. She said, "We prepare the counter." The counter wasn't legal. It wasn't emotional. It was hydrological. That night, Oliver met with Delmar and a retired systems consultant from the Department of Water Control. Together, they reviewed every sensor report, every overflow simulation, every rate of change scenario. What they discovered was sobering. Continued unauthorized construction across the lake was altering the pressure curve of the basin. The new pilings and docks weren't just decorative. They were disrupting natural sediment flow, increasing directional stress toward the auxiliary trench. If left unchecked, the trench could collapse during the next flood season. And if it did, the release wouldn't be controlled. It would be a breach. There was one solution: a full-scale drain. Not partial, not a test. a controlled, documented reduction of lake volume to pre-development levels, entirely legal under Oliver's original maintenance authority, still in force due to the private nature of the valve system. It would lower the lake dramatically, expose shoreline infrastructure, invalidate dozens of pending construction permits, and trigger immediate environmental review that could freeze development indefinitely. But it had to be done surgically, legally, no theatrics. Oliver issued the notice 3 days later. It was precise. Valve reduction to begin Monday at 7 a.m., projected drawdown of lake volume by 38%, duration not to exceed 72 hours. Reason, structural stabilization, and breach risk mitigation. He submitted it through official county channels, copied the Environmental Board, tagged the Regional Flood Risk Bureau, and ensured the entire operation was coordinated with sensor logs, engineer sign-offs, and legal coverage. When the water began to recede, it was quiet. No alarms, no shouting, just slow exposure of mud, of root systems, of half-finished dock extensions that now rested awkwardly on cracked concrete. Some of the floating platforms began to tilt. Others sagged into sediment. The shoreline markers, carefully installed to define resale-ready boundaries, now stuck out in the air, absurdly suspended above ground that no longer touched water. Real estate listings disappeared overnight. Calls were made. Urgent meetings were held. But the drain could not be stopped. One local agent described it as a visual decapitation. The lake, once a symbol of balance and value, now looked like a drained basin. Ugly. Naked. Real. A letter from the neighborhood's executive committee arrived in Oliver's mailbox the following day, pleading for reconsideration and offering collaborative redesign opportunities. He didn't reply. He didn't need to, because by then the state had issued an emergency review of the development's hydrological plan. Construction was frozen. Permits were suspended. Environmental compliance officers began site visits. And the regional news, not viral videos, not social media, but dry, bureaucratic headlines, reported private infrastructure triggers reassessment of county shoreline viability. Oliver watched all this from his porch. Not triumphant, not bitter, just steady. A man who hadn't started a war, but who had remembered how to end one. Quietly, precisely, without ever leaving his land. By the time the full drawdown reached its lowest point, the lake no longer resembled a body of water so much as a wound cut deep across the land. Its muddy floor exposed in streaks of black clay and dull ochre, its shoreline bent in angles that revealed the artificiality of everything the development had tried to pass off as organic beauty. The peninsula, once reachable only by Oliver's Bridge, now stood plainly connected to the main embankment by a wide swath of hard-packed silt, a truth no longer deniable. The separation had never been absolute, only maintained, and that maintenance had always belonged to him. The damage to the other side began to manifest in slow, almost comic patterns. Docks pitched like broken ribs, support beams embedded awkwardly in nothing but air, manicured lawns now curled and yellowing where irrigation systems had overcompensated for the falling waterline. But the real fracture wasn't aesthetic. It was legal. Property valuations began to plummet, not dramatically, but enough to trigger financial alerts among mortgage lenders. Buyers withdrew. Brokers hesitated. The county tax assessor's office, now faced with reassessing dozens of high-end parcels with compromised shoreline access, initiated formal reviews, and as these spiraled outward into overlapping regulatory inquiries, the once confident board that had driven the entire expansion campaign began to unravel from within. The first to fold was the communications chair, a man who, according to a leak received by Darlene, had quietly resigned and vacated his property within a week of the drawdown, selling well below market value to a non-local holding company. The second was the finance liaison, who attempted to push through an emergency motion to reclassify the development as temporarily environmentally disrupted, only to be overruled by county compliance, who cited falsified survey data dating back to the initial floating dock expansions. That falsification triggered a cascade. County oversight opened an audit. Environmental quality flagged the shoreline work as having proceeded without the required stabilization permits. Even the Department of Water Infrastructure, which had previously treated the region as low priority, dispatched a liaison to monitor the remaining hydraulic structures, a move that signaled to everyone watching that the situation had metastasized into something the developers could no longer manage internally. Oliver, meanwhile, didn't gloat. He kept working, quietly, methodically, overseeing the sediment assessments and runoff calibration reports required by the emergency drawdown protocol. Every adjustment he made was logged. Every action justified. And while the media interest remained low, a small flurry of local coverage quickly buried under more sensational headlines, the institutional attention deepened. His land was no longer viewed as an obstacle. It was now a precedent, a demonstration of private infrastructural authority correctly exercised in the face of unauthorized encroachment. And that precedent, well documented, indisputable, began to chill conversations and other development meetings across the region. Where once expansion was assumed, now caution returned. Where once everyone asked, "How much can we take?" now someone always asked, "Who might stop us?" Still, the committee didn't fully concede. Not yet. They attempted one final maneuver. Not overt, but precise. A newly hired compliance strategist for the development filed a civil claim asserting that Oliver's emergency valve release had knowingly created negative market outcomes with intent to inflict financial harm, a legal euphemism for sabotage. It was weak, speculative, and carried no criminal teeth, but its timing was strategic. It arrived 3 days before Oliver was scheduled to begin Phase 2 of the lakebed cleanup, the sediment redistribution and slope, fortification that would formalize the lake's new, lower stable state. The claim, though not a full injunction, was enough to trigger a temporary stay under administrative procedure. That delay cost him time. More importantly, it gave the opposing side a window to mount a media effort, portraying the drain as an overreaction by a lone private actor, and suggesting to investors that the crisis was being exaggerated. Darlene responded not with rhetoric, but with documentation. She submitted a 7-page affidavit to the county board listing every instance of unauthorized construction, every undeclared structural addition, and every failure of notification tied to the development's side of the lake. She included signed witness statements from surveyors, copies of falsified permit applications, drone footage showing nighttime construction on restricted zones, and internal emails, obtained through a well-placed records request, in which one committee member openly referred to Oliver's valve as the lever we need to disable, one way or another. The day after that filing, the civil claim was withdrawn, or not dismissed, not ruled against, simply pulled, silently, strategically, as if no one had ever filed it at all. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was capitulation. Slowly, but definitively, the development board shifted posture. Where once there had been pressure, now there were invitations. Letters arrived couched in conciliatory language, exploring joint stewardship, developing shared resource strategies, formalizing watershed partnership frameworks. Oliver didn't respond. He sent all correspondence to Darlene, who replied, in her uniquely dry tone, "My client is no longer interested in speculative collaboration." At the same time, Oliver filed with the State Land Commission to register the peninsula and adjacent. shoreline as a private conservation tract under restrictive ecological protection, a move that made any future structural alteration subject to state-level environmental review with no timeline guarantees. He then transferred long-term management of the tract to a regional land trust, ensuring its status for the next 25 years, regardless of future ownership. He did not sell. He did not lease. He simply locked it, not out of spite but as a statement. By the end of spring, the lake had settled into its new equilibrium. Lower, quieter, less polished. The development remained, of course. No one bulldozed houses, but its expansion halted. Construction equipment disappeared. Property listings slowed. The grand waterfront pavilion project, once the flagship proposal of the redevelopment board, was canceled quietly without announcement. No apology came. No reparation. But that didn't matter. The system had been corrected, not by destruction, but by pressure, applied legally, patiently, and in full view of the mechanisms designed to handle it. Oliver took his walks again in the early morning, tracing the curve of the dry stone bank that once sat hidden beneath the lake's surface. He monitored the regrowth, noted the return of shorebirds, marked the migration of silt with a surveyor's eye. He didn't build a new bridge. He didn't need one. The path to the peninsula was now solid underfoot, a testament not to victory, but to memory, of a boundary preserved, of a system upheld, of a man who didn't flinch when they tried to make him yield. Summer arrived later than usual that year, dragging behind it a wet spring and leaving the air thick with pollen and the smell of new sediment. The lake, though still diminished in volume, had found a kind of quiet dignity in its new form. It no longer shimmered with artificial stillness. Instead, it moved slowly with the natural inertia of something no longer being controlled from the shadows. Oliver walked its edge every morning with the same precision he had applied to everything else in his life, cataloging growth patterns along the newly formed banks, documenting the first signs of bulrush sprouting near the spilled trench, marking the presence of bird species that hadn't visited in years. The peninsula, now fully accessible by foot across a hardened stretch of dry lake bed, had become his quiet frontier. Not as a possession to be enforced, but as a memory of resistance formalized into shape. No one from the development side had spoken to him directly since the withdrawal of the civil claim. Not even the new board president, a retired executive who had been brought in to calm investor sentiment and rebuild stakeholder confidence, dared approach him personally. Instead, the acknowledgments came indirectly. A banner advertising eco-conscious lakefront living, quietly removed from the main boulevard. Language about shared water governance scrubbed from their website. The once prominent Lakeside Commons project now relegated to a vague placeholder on long-term planning maps with no start date. Even the drone flights had ceased, replaced now by the occasional appearance of a white truck from the Environmental Quality Board conducting soil sampling on their side of the basin, taking notes that were never shared and expressions that suggested a long-term audit was already in motion. Oliver didn't celebrate this. He didn't smile when he saw them. He simply watched and recorded. He knew better than to assume it was over. Systems like the one that had tried to consume his land didn't disappear. They retreated. They rebranded. They waited for memory to dull and for documents to expire. That's why the final step he took was permanent. Not defensive, but assertive in the quietest, most absolute way. The Conservation Trust that now owned long-term stewardship over his shoreline was bound not only by environmental review but by funding clauses tied to 3 different state agencies. That meant oversight, renewal schedules, physical inspections, and a paper trail thicker than any HOA could penetrate. But Oliver added something else. On a dry, cloudless morning, he mounted a bronze plaque on a stone marker near the edge of the old bridge's footprint, facing west toward the far side of the lake. The inscription was short, chiseled clean and unadorned. Here stood balance, removed without consent, replaced without permission, remembered without apology. There was no name, no date, just truth. He rarely crossed the peninsula now. There was nothing left to protect in it, and nothing he needed from it. Its purpose had been fulfilled not by isolation, but by exposure. The act of drawing light to a place that others wanted to map in shadows. What had begun as a simple trespass, a silent subtraction of a wooden structure in the night, had grown into a confrontation that reached from shorelines to boardrooms, from valves to policy reviews. And the fact that it had been resolved not by force, not by protest, not by spectacle, but by the exact systems the aggressors tried to circumvent, that was the final irony. The same infrastructure they attempted to steal had held its own ground, and the man they thought could be outmaneuvered had simply known his own tools better than they did. The air around the lake remained quiet now, not sterile like before, but alive in its own tempo. Frogs hidden in the reeds, the occasional splash of a turtle, wind threading through the new shoots of cattails. Property values on the far side had stabilized, though not recovered. No one talked about expansion anymore. And the idea of rebuilding the bridge never surfaced, not even from Oliver himself, because the land no longer needed to be connected. It had already spoken for itself, quietly, permanently, in full view of anyone willing to read the lines not drawn on maps but embedded in the soil itself.